Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Book Club Commune with me, Ivy Poeasy. In this episode, we're going to be reading Chapter 8 of Black Bolshevik, Self-Determination, The Struggle for a Correct Line. I don't have any other updates for you at the start of this episode, so let's just go ahead and get into the episode. Chapter 8, Self-Determination and the Fight for a Correct Line. Towards the end of 1927, Nazarov returned to the Soviet Union after a sojourn in the United States as the representative of the Young Communist International. I had known him briefly in the States before my departure for Russia. Nazarov was one of a group of YCI workers who had been sent on missions to several countries. He had considerable experience with respect to national and colonial questions and was considered an expert on these matters. Nazanov's observations had convinced him that U.S. blacks were essentially an oppressed nation whose struggle for equality would ultimately take an autonomous direction, and that the content of the Black Liberation Movement was the completion of the agrarian and democratic revolution in the South, a struggle which was left unresolved by the Civil War and betrayal of Reconstruction. Therefore, it was the duty of the party to channel the movement into a revolutionary direction by raising and supporting the slogan of the right of self-determination for Afro-Americans in the Black Belt, the area of their greatest concentration. Upon his return, Nazarov sought me out, and it was he, I believe, who first informed me that I had been elected to the National Committee of the YCL back in the States. In the months ahead, we were to become close friends. Through him, I met a number of YCI people, mostly Soviet comrades, who had held the same position as Nazarov did on the national question. They seemed to be pushing to have the matter reviewed at the forthcoming 6th Congress of the Comintern, and, as it was later became clear to me, they were anxious to recruit at least one black to support their position. As I have indicated before, the position was not entirely new to me. I was present at the meeting of the YCL District Committee in Chicago in 1924 when Bob Moutz, then YCI rep to the U.S., at the behest of Zinoviev, had raised the question of self-determination at the time. At the time, he had been shouted down by white comrades. See Chapter 4. Sen Katayama had told us black Kutva students that Lenin regarded U.S. blacks as an oppressed nation and referred us to his draft resolution on the national and colonial question, which was adopted by the Second Congress of the Comintern in 1920. Otto and other black students had also told me that they had had similar impression from their meeting with Stalin at the Kremlin shortly after their arrival in the Soviet Union. All of this seemed tentative to me. No one elaborated the position fully, and Nazarov was the first person I met who attempted to argue it definitively. But all of these arguments, and especially Nazarov's prodding, set me to thinking, and confronted me with the need to apply concretely my newly acquired Marxist-Leninist knowledge on the national colonial questions to the condition of the blacks in the United States. To me, the idea of a black nation within the U.S. boundaries seemed far-fetched and not consonant with American reality. I saw the solution through its incorporation of blacks into U.S. society on the basis of complete equality, and only socialism could bring this to pass. There's no doubt in my mind that the path to freedom for blacks led directly to socialism, uncluttered by any interim stage of self-determination or black political power. The unity of black and white workers against the common enemy, U.S. capitalism, was the motor leading towards the dual goal of black freedom and socialism. I felt that it was difficult enough to build this unity without adding to it the gratuitous assumption of a non-existent black nation, with its implication of a separate state on U.S. soil. To do so, I felt, was to create a new and unnecessary roadblocks to this already difficult path to black and white unity. Socialism, I reasoned, was not in contradiction to the movement of for Black cultural identity, expressed in Cultural Renaissance in the 20s, and Garvey's emphasis on race pride in history, which I regarded as one of the positive aspects of that movement. Socialism for U.S. blacks did not imply a loss of cultural identity any more than it did for Jews of the Soviet Union, among whom I witnessed the proliferation of positive features of the Jewish culture, theater, literature, and language. The Jews were not considered a nation because they were not concentrated in any definite territory. They were regarded as a national minority, and Birobidzhan was set aside as a Jewish autonomous province. Such a bolstering of self-respect, dignity, and self-assertion on the part of the formerly oppressed minority people was a necessary stage in the development of a universal culture, which would amalgamate the best features of all national groups. This was definitely the policy of the Soviet Union with regards to formerly oppressed nationalities and ethnic groups. Like the Jews, I reasoned the position of U.S. blacks was that of an oppressed race, that at the time I am sure I would have been hard-pressed to define precisely what was meant by that phrase. The main factor in the opposition of Jews under the Tsar had been the religious factor. The main factor with U.S. blacks was race. Blacks lost some of the essential attributes of a nation, which had been defined by Stalin in his classic work, Marxism and the National Question. Most assuredly, I could argue among blacks there existed elements of a special culture and a common language, English. But this did not add up to a nation, I reasoned. Missing was the all-important aspects of a national territory. Even if one agreed that the Black Belt, where blacks were largely concentrated, rightfully belonged to them, they were in no geographic position to assert the right to self-determination. I can see many analogies between the national problem in the old Tsarist Empire and the problem of U.S. blacks. The analogy floundered on the question of territory, for the subjective nations of the old Tsarist Empire were situated either on the border of the oppressing Great Russian nation or were completely outside it. But American blacks were set down in the very midst of the oppressing white nation, the strongest capitalist power on earth. Faced with this, it was no wonder that the most nationalist movements up until then had taken the road of a separate state outside the United States. How could one convince U.S. blacks that the right to self-determination was a realistic program? Nazanov and his young friends answered my arguments over the course of a series of discussions. They were quick to pick out the flaws in my position. They contended that I was guilty of an ahistoric approach with respect to the elements of nationhood. Certainly there were some attributes of a nation were weakly developed in the case of U.S. blacks, but that was the case with most oppressed peoples, precisely because of the imperialist policy of national oppression is directly towards artificially and forcibly retaining the economic and cultural backwardness of the colonial peoples as a condition for their super-exploitation. My mistake had been to ignore Lenin's dictum in that the epoch of imperialism it is essential to differentiate between the oppressor and the oppressed nations. They further contended that I had presented the matter as though self-determination were solely a question for blacks. I therefore separated the black rebellion from the struggle for socialism in the United States. In fact, it was a constituent part of the latter struggle, or more precisely, a special phase of the struggle of the American working class for socialism. My argument added up to a defense of the current position of the U.S. Party, albeit I embellished the position somewhat against Nazanov's criticisms. Up to this point, the black students had not challenged the party's line on Afro-American work. We reasoned that the party's default in the work among blacks was not the result of an incorrect line, but came from a failure to carry out in practice its declared line. We believe that this failure was due to an underestimation of the importance of work among blacks, which came from an underestimation of the revolutionary potential of the struggle of black masses for equality. All this resulted from the persistence of remnants of white racist ideology within the ranks of the party, including some of its leadership. Nazanov and some of his friends agreed with us that the American CP did underestimate the revolutionary potential of the black struggle for equality. But, they maintained, under this This underestimation came from a fundamentally incorrect social democratic line rather than white chauvinism. They said that I had stood the whole matter on its head. I had presented the incorrect policies as a result of subjective white chauvinist attitudes, whereas they pointed out that the white chauvinist attitudes persisted precisely because the party's line was fundamentally incorrect, in that it denied the national character of the question. Our American comrades seemed to think only the direct struggle for socialism is revolutionary, they told me, and that the national movement detracts from the struggle and is therefore reactionary. This, they pointed out, was an American version of the pure proletarian revolution concept. They referred me to Lenin's polemic against Radek on the question of self-determination. The Bolsheviks also criticized my formulation on the matter as primarily a race question. To call the matter a race question, they said, was to fall into the bourgeois liberal trap of regarding the fight for equality as primarily a fight against racial prejudices of whites. This slurred over the economic and social roots of the question, and obscured the question of the agrarian democratic revolution in the South, which was pivotal to the struggle of black equality throughout the country. They pointed out that it was wrong to counterpose the struggle for equality to the struggle of self-determination. For in fact, the South's self-determination for blacks, political power in their own hands, was the guarantee of equality. History of the question in the Comintern. In these discussions with my young friends, which extended over the course of several months, I became keenly aware of the gaps in my understanding of Marxist-Leninist theory on the national colonial question. I was to find, as Nazanoff and others had indicated, that the idea of blacks as an oppressed nation was not new in the Comintern. Though Stalin was undoubtedly the person pushing the position at the time, it had not originated with him, but with Lenin himself. It had first appeared in Lenin's draft theses on the national colonial question, which he submitted to the Second Congress of the Comintern in 1920. The draft, which was later adopted, called upon the Communist parties to render direct aid to the revolutionary movements among the dependent and underprivileged nations, for example, Ireland, the American Negroes, etc., and in the colonies. Some have argued that Lenin's reference to U.S. blacks as a subject nation was merely a tentative deduction. When he submitted the draft, he asked the delegates for opinions and suggestions on 15 points, one of which was Negroes in America. It was recorded, however, that the Colonial Commission of the Congress, which Lenin himself headed, and in which Sen Katayama was a leading member, held lengthy discussions on the question of U.S. blacks. John Reed, the American author, was a delegate and participated in the discussion, apparently in opposition to Lenin's formulations. In fact, he made two speeches, one in the Commission, other to the Congress, contending that the problem of U.S. blacks was that of both a strong race movement and a strong proletarian workers' movement, which is rapidly developing class consciousness. Equating all national movements among blacks to Garvey's back to Africa separatism, he contended that a movement which struggles for a separate national existence has no success among the Negroes, like the Back to Africa movement, for example, and that blacks consider themselves above all Americans. They feel at home in the United States. This makes the task of communists very much easier. But despite Reed's objections, the reference to American blacks as an oppressed nation remained in the resolution as finally adopted. For Lenin's thesis was not something spun out of thin air, but was a result of a serious study of the question. This is clear from his work, New Data on the Laws Governing the Development of Capitalism in Agriculture, which spoke about the United States. In this work, published in 1915, and based off the U.S. Census of 1910, Lenin viewed the question of blacks in the South as one of an uncompleted agrarian or bourgeois democratic revolution. He drew attention to the remarkably similarity between the economic positions of the South's black tenants and the emancipated serfs in the agrarian centers of Russia, pointing out that both groups were not tenants in the European civil sense, but semi-slaves and sharecroppers. Emphasizing the absence of the elementary democratic rights among blacks, he alluded to the South as the most stagnant area, where the masses are subjected to the greatest degradation and oppression, a kind of prison. These emancipated Negroes are hemmed in, isolated, and deprived of fresh air. These kinds of conditions, the law of the vast majority of U.S. blacks undoubtedly led Lenin to conclude that the movement for emancipation would take a national revolutionary direction. Conclusive proof of Lenin's thinking was that at the time with respect to U.S. blacks can be found in an uncompleted work written in 1917, though not available until 1935. The work, Statistics and Sociology, was begun in the early part of 1917, but was interrupted by the February Revolution and never resumed. In the section of the manuscript referring to U.S. blacks, he drew a clear distinction between the positions and that of the foreign-born immigrants, that is, between the white foreign-born assimilables and the black unassimilables. In the United States, the Negroes, and also the mulattoes and Indians, account only for 11.1%. This should be classed as an oppressed nation, for the equality won in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865 and guaranteed by the Constitution of the Republic was in many respects increasingly curtailed in the chief Negro areas, the South, and in connection with the transition from the progressive pre-monopoly capitalism of 1860 to 1870 to the reactionary monopoly imperialism of the new era. Whereas the white foreign-born immigrants, Lenin observed that the speed of development of capitalism in America had speedily and fundamentally, as nowhere else in the world, smoothed out to form a single American national. All of this shows that the idea that U.S. blacks comprised an oppressed nation was neither a temporary nor tentative formulation on Lenin's part. Despite the thesis of the Second Congress International, Reed's views, reflecting as they did the position of the young American Party, were to persist in the U.S. without serious challenge through the Fifth Congress of the Comintern. The Third Congress of 1921 recorded no discussion with respect to the character of the problem. The Fourth Congress in 1922 also did not seriously discuss the point. This meeting, however, marked the first appearance of black delegates to the Comintern. They were Otto Hoyswood as a regular party delegate, and the poet Claude McKay as a special fraternal delegate. It was also the first Congress to set up a Negro Commission, and extended discussions took place on the thesis brought in by the Commission, which characterized the position of U.S. blacks as an aspect of the colonial question. It stressed the special role of American blacks in support of the liberation struggles of Africa, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. The thesis of the Fourth Congress did add a new international dimension to the question, but did not challenge the party's basic anti-self-determination position. This position was stressed in a speech by Hoywood Billings, which called the Afro-American question another phase of the racial and colonial question, and an essentially economic problem, which was intensified by the friction which exists between white and black races. The discussion of the character of the question came up in the Fifth Congress of 1924, this time in connection with the draft program of the Communist International. For the first time since the Second Congress, discussion centered directly on the character of the question as an oppressed nation and the appropriateness of the slogan of the right to self-determination. August Thalheimer, the German head of the Commission on the Draft Program, reported that the slogan of the right of self-determination cannot solve all national questions. Such is the case in the United States, where there is an extraordinary mixed population, and where the race question is also involved. Therefore, he pointed out, the Program Commission was of the opinion that the slogan of the right of self-determination must be supplemented by another slogan, equal rights for all nationalities and races. Representing the U.S. at the Fifth Congress, John Pepper supported this anti-self-determination position. According to him, the United States was a country in which the different nationalities could not be separated. Self-determination was not appropriate. Blacks in the U.S. did not want it. They did not want to set up a separate state inside the USA. They wished to remain inside the U.S., not to leave it for Africa. To the demand of the social equality, he held that we should change these words to the following: full equality in every respect. Lovett Fort Whiteman, the sole black delegate, apparently supported Pepper's position and gave his standard speech, which I was to hear a number of times in the States. He stressed the racial aspect of the problem and called for a special communist approach to blacks. There appeared to be no opposition to the draft program, but after all, it was only the first version. The program in its final form was to be discussed and adopted in the 6th Congress. Apparently, Zinoviev and the other CIA leadership were not satisfied with the formulation and had rejected self-determination for U.S. blacks. Zinoviev had instructed Bob Mazut to investigate the question while on his assignment to the U.S. immediately following the Congress. Such was the situation following the 5th Congress. The question can be raised as to why the U.S. party's position was not seriously challenged during this whole period, and why the proponents in the Comintern of self-determination thesis failed to press for their position. Their reluctance in this regard, I presume, was because they did not want to push their position against the unanimous opposition of the American Party, including its black members. After all, the Comintern was a voluntary union of communist parties, which operated under democratic centralism. It was not the policy of the Comintern leadership to arbitrarily force positions on member parties. South Africa. This line, formulated the year before the cooperation with Laguma during his first visit to the Soviet Union in the spring of 1927, had been rejected by the leadership of the South African Party. Laguma, as I recall, was a young brown-skinned man of Malagasy and French parentage. In South Africa, this placed him in the colored category, a rung among natives on the racial ladder established by white supremacist rulers. Colored persons were defined as those of mixed blood, including descendants of Javanese slaves, mixed in varying degrees with European whites. Laguma, however, identified completely with the natives and their movement. He had been General Secretary of the ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Union, and the Federation of Native Trade Unions, and also Secretary of the Cape Town branch of the ANC. Later, after his expulsion from the ICU by the red-baiting clique of Clement Cadley, a native Social Democrat, Laguma became the secretary of the Non-European Trade Union Federation in Cape Town. Laguma was the first South African communist I'd ever met. I was delighted and impressed with him and was able to find in the course of our brief collaboration striking parallels between the struggle of U.S. blacks for equality and those of the native South Africans. In both countries, the white leadership of their respective parties underestimated the revolutionary potential of the black movement. Laguma had made his first trip to Moscow a year before. He and Joshua Gamunde, president of the ANC, had come as delegates with the inaugural conference of the League Against Imperialism, which had convened in Brussels, Belgium, in February 1927. Gamunde had attended as a delegate from the ANC, while Laguma was a delegate from the South African Communist Party. It was Laguma's first international gathering, and he had the opportunity to meet with leaders from colonial and semi-colonial countries to discuss the South African question with them. Madame Sun Yat-sen and Pandit Nehru were among those present. The conference adopted the resolution of the South African delegates on the right of self-determination through the complete overthrow of imperialism. The general resolutions of the Congress proclaimed Africa for the Africans, and their full freedom and equality with the other races, and the right to govern Africa. After Brussels, Laguma went on a speaking tour to Germany, after which he came to Moscow. Though the Brussels conference has called for the right to self-determination, it left unanswered many specific questions that were raised by the slogan. Were the natives in South Africa a nation? What was to be done with the whites? Laguma was to find the answer to these questions in Moscow, where he consulted ECCI leaders, including Bukharin, who was then president of the Comintern. He participated with the ECCI leaders and the formulation of the resolution of the South African question, calling for the return of the land to the natives and for an independent native South African republic as a stage towards a workers' and peasants' republic with full equal rights for all races. Laguma returned to South Africa with the resolution in June 1927. Gimere also arrived home the same month, but the resolution was received hostilely by Bunting and was rejected by the South African leadership at its annual conference in December 1927. Bunting was a British lawyer who'd come to South Africa some years before. An early South African socialist and founder of the Communist Party, he was the son of a British peer. As Bunting later commented, he nearly used up the small fortune he inherited in support of the party work and publications. Bunting and his followers insisted that the South African Revolution, unlike those in the colonies, was a direct struggle for socialism without any intermediary stages. To the Comintern slogan of a native South African republic, Bunting counterposed the slogan of a workers' and peasants' republic. This concept of pure proletarian revolution was an echo of what we'd had in the U.S. Party with respect to blacks, but here the error stood out grotesquely given the reality of the South African situation with its overwhelming native majority. It was against this background that Laguma and Gimere left to go to Moscow to attend the 10th anniversary celebrations of the Congress of the Friends of the Soviet Union. Laguma apparently was not in Moscow on that occasion. He was probably on tour of the provinces, but he and Gimere traveled widely throughout their visit of the Soviet Union. Our purpose at this time was to develop and clarify the line laid down in the resolution formulated the previous year. Our draft, with a few changes, was adopted by the 6th Congress of the Comintern and the ECCI. As we already noted, Bunting had put forward a slogan of South African workers' and peasants' government. Bunting's formulation denied the colonial character of South Africa. He failed, therefore, to see the inherent revolutionary nature of the native struggle for emancipation. As opposed to this, our resolution began with the definition of South Africa as a British dominion of the colonial type, whose colonial features included 1. The country was exploited by British imperialism, with the participation of the South African white bourgeoisie, British and Boer, with white capital occupying principal economic position. 2. The overwhelming majority of the population were native and colored, 5 million natives and colored, 1.5 million whites, according to the 1921 census. Natives who held only 1/8 of the land were almost completely landless, the great bulk of their land having been expropriated by the white minority. 4. The great difference in wages and material conditions of the white and black proletariat, and the widespread corruption of the white workers by the racist propaganda and the ideology of the imperialists. These features we held determine the character of the South African and non-European peoples for independence and land. As the previous revolution had done, our draft in the form and adopted by the 6th Congress and the ECCI held that as a result of these conditions, in order to lead and influence that movement, communists, black and white, must put forward and fight for the general political slogan of an independent native South African republic as a stage towards a workers' and peasants' republic with full equal rights for all races, black, colored, and white. South Africa is a black country, the resolution went on to say, with a mainly black peasant population, whose land had been expropriated by white colonizers. Therefore, the agrarian question lies at the foundation of the revolution. The black peasantry, in alliance with and under the leadership of the working class, is the main driving force. Thus, along with the slogan of the Native Republic, the party must place the slogan, "Return the land to the natives." This latter formulation does not appear in the resolution as finally adopted. Instead, it includes the two following formulations. 1. Whites must accept the correct principle that South Africa belongs to the native population. And 2. The basic question of the agrarian situation in South Africa is the land hunger of the blacks, and their interests is of prior importance in the solution of the agrarian question. With the new resolutions completed, Laguma returned to South Africa. In the years since the first resolution, the opposition to the line had intensified, and had already come to a head at the December Party Congress, even before Laguma returned. Bunting put forward his position at a 14-page document in early 1928. He equated nationalism of the Boer minority to the nationalism of the natives, and justified his opposition to nationalism on the basis that all national movements were subject to capitalist corruption, and in the case of South Africa, a national movement among natives would probably only accelerate the fusion in opposition to it of the Dutch and British imperialists, since it would only consolidate the forces against it. It was not to be supported. Bunting not only underrated nationalism, he played on the whites' fear of it, and raised the specter of blacks being given free rein, with the resulting campaign to drive the whites into the sea. He was echoing the specter that was haunting whites who remembered the song of Zosas, to chase the white man from the earth and drive them to the sea that cast them up at first. For Amazon's curse and bane howls for the progeny she nursed, to swallow them again. According to Bunting, the elimination of whites seemed to be implied in the slogan of a native republic. He regarded the phrase "safeguards for minorities" as having little meaning, since whites would assume that the existing injustices would be reversed, that, in effect, blacks would do to them what they had been handing out for so long. While Bunting had held that all nationalism was reactionary, Laguma distinguished between the revolutionary nationalism of the natives and the nationalism of the Boers, which in reality was simply a quarrel between sections of the ruling class. He argued that the communists must not hold back on the revolutionary demands of the natives in order to pacify the white workers, who are still saturated with an imperialist ideology and conscious of the privileges they enjoy at the natives' expense. Bunting held up that the road to socialism would be better traveled under white leadership. The securing of black rights was the first step to be taken. As Simonis described it, first establish an African majority rule, he argued, and unity leading to socialism would follow. Laguma called on communists to build up a mass party based upon non-European masses, put forward the slogan of a native republic, and thus destroy the traditional subservience to whites among Africans. This argument continued up through the Sixth Congress. 1928. A re-examination of the question. How are we to account, then, for the renewed interest in the Afro-American question among certain influential leaders of the Comintern on the eve of the Sixth Congress? Why was the drive to reopen the question? The answer lies in the changed world situation, the sharpened crisis of the world capitalist system, consequent on breaking down partial capitalist stabilization, the beginning of the deepening economic depression in Europe, the continued upsurge in the colonial revolutions in India, China, and Indonesia. These harbingers of the new period were pointed out by Stalin in the 15th Congress of the CPSU in early December 1927, in which he referred to the collapsing stabilization of capitalism. It was to be a period of revolutionary struggle. In order to lead this struggle, an attack on the right opportunism was required in the practice and work of the communist parties. It was a period in which the national and colonial question was to acquire a new urgency. The CI paid special attention to the fight against these views, which liquidated or downplayed the importance of the question. In this context, the Comintern felt that the establishment of a revolutionary line on the Afro-American question was key if the CPUSA was to lead the joint struggle of the black and white working masses in the coming period. The low status of CP's Negro work was itself another factor pressing for the radical policy review. There had been no progress in this work, despite the prodding the Comintern had already mentioned. The high-touted American Negro Labor Congress had failed to even get off the ground. In a speech at the Sixth Congress, James Ford countered 19 communications from the Comintern to the U.S. Party on Negro work, none of which had been put into effect or brought before the party. He further observed that we have no more than 50 Negroes in our party out of the 12 million Negroes in America. Out of all these factors strengthened the determination of the Comintern to make the Sixth Congress the arena for drastic reevaluation of the work of the policy in this area. In the winter of 1928, preparations were already afoot for the Sixth Congress, which was to convene the following summer. The Anglo-American Secretariat of the CI was set up a special subcommittee on the Negro question, which would prepare a draft resolution for the official Negro Commission of the Congress. As I recall, the subcommittee consisted of Nazanov and 5 students, 4 blacks, including my brother Otto and myself, and 1 white student, Clarence Hathaway, from the London School. In addition, there were some ex officio members, Profintern Rep. Bill Doone and Comintern Rep. Bob Miner. They seldom attended our sessions. James Ford, who was then assigned to the Profintern, also attended some. Our subcommittee met and broke the subject down into topics. Each of us accepted one as his assignment to research and report to the committee as a whole. The high point of the discussion was the report of my brother Otto on Garvey's Back to Africa movement. In his report, he concluded that nationalism expressed in the movement had no objective base in the economic, social, and political conditions of blacks. It was, he asserted, a foreign importation artificially grafted onto the movement of U.S. blacks by West Indian nationalist Garvey. U.S. blacks, Otto concluded, were not an oppressed nation, but an oppressed racial minority. The long-range goal of the movement was not the right of self-determination, but complete economic, social, and political equality, to be won through revolutionary lines of blacks and class-conscious white labor in a joint struggle for socialism against the common enemy, U.S. capitalism. Up to that point, I was still not certain as regard the applicability of the right to self-determination to the problems of blacks in the U.S., for my misgivings about the slogan had been shaken somewhat by a serious discussion I had with my Russian friends. Otto, in his report, had merely restated the CP's current position, but somehow, against the background of our discussion of the Garvey movement and the inadequacy of that position, stood out like a sore thumb. Otto, however, had done more than simply restate the position. He brought it out into the open, what had been implicit in the party's position all along, that is, any type of nationalism among blacks was reactionary. This view, it occurred to me, was the logical outcome of any position which saw only the pure proletarian class struggle as the sole revolutionary struggle against capitalism. The party had traditionally considered the Afro-American question as that of a persecuted racial minority. They centered their activity almost exclusively on blacks as workers and treated the question as basically a simple trade union matter, underrating other aspects of the struggle. The struggle for equal rights was seen as a diversion that would obscure or overshadow the struggle for socialism. But how could one wage a fight against the white chauvinism from that position? I thought at the time that viewing everything in light of the trade union question would lead to a denial of the revolutionary potential of the struggle of the whole people for equality. Otto's rejection of nationalism as an indigenous trend brought these points out sharply in my mind. In the discussion, I pointed out that Otto's position was not merely a rejection of Garveyism, but also a denial of nationalism as a legitimate trend in the Black freedom movement. I felt that it amounted to throwing out the baby with the bathwater. With my insight sharpened by previous discussions, I argued further that the nationalism reflected in the Garvey movement was not a foreign transplant, nor did it spring full-blown out of the brow of Jove. On the contrary, it was an indigenous product arising from the soil of black super-exploitation and the oppression of the United States. It expressed the yearnings of millions of blacks for a nation of their own. I pursued this logic. A totally new thought occurred to me. And for me, it was the clincher. The Garvey movement is dead. I reasoned, but not black nationalism. Nationalism, which Garvey diverted under the slogan of Back to Africa, was an authentic trend, likely to flare up again in periods of crisis and stress. Such a movement might fall under the leadership of utopian visionaries who would seek to divert it from the struggle against the main enemy, U.S. imperialism, and onto a reactionary separatist path. The only way such a diversion of the struggle could be forestalled was by presenting a revolutionary alternative to blacks. To the slogan of Back to Africa, I argued we must counter the slogan of the right of self-determination here in the Deep South. Our slogan for the U.S. Black Rebellion, therefore, must be the right of self-determination in the South, with full equality throughout the country, to be won through revolutionary alliance with politically conscious white workers against the common enemy, U.S. imperialism. Nazanov was seated across the table from me during this discussion, and elated at my presentation. He demonstratively rose to shake my hand. I was the first American communist, with perhaps the exception of Briggs, to support the thesis of U.S. blacks constituted an oppressed nation. The next day, Nazov and I submitted a resolution to the subcommittee incorporating our views. We couldn't get a majority, but we had Hathaway's support, as I remember. It was agreed that the resolution be submitted to the Anglo-American Secretariat as the views of those who subscribed to it, and those who disagreed with it would present their own views. The only really persistent opposition in the subcommittee, as I remember, came from Otto. The other students were somewhat ambivalent on the question. I attributed much of this to Sick's influence, since he had already begun to develop his position, which held that the question of U.S. blacks was a race question, and that blacks should not demand self-determination, but full social and political equality. His theories were later used by Lovestonites and others in the opposition to self-determination policy. Once my hesitations were overcome, the whole theory fell logically into place. Here is the full analysis I came to understand it. The thesis that called for the right of self-determination is supported by a serious economic historical analysis of U.S. blacks. The evolution of the American blacks as an oppressed nation was begun in slavery. In the final analysis, however, it was a result of the unfinished bourgeois democratic revolution of the Civil War and the betrayal of Reconstruction through the Hayes-Tilden, the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1877. This betrayal was followed by the withdrawal of federal troops and the unleashing of counter-revolutionary terror, including the massacre of thousands of blacks and the overthrow of the Reconstruction government, which had been based on an alliance of blacks, poor whites, and carpetbaggers. The result was that of the black freedmen, deserted by their former Republican allies, were left without land, their newly won rights destroyed, with the abrogation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, were thrust back into the plantations of their former masters, in a position but little removed from chattel bondage. The revolution has stopped short of a solution to the crucial land question. There was neither confiscation of the big plantations of the former slaveholding class, nor distribution of the land among the Negro freedmen and poor whites. It is around this issue of the land for the freedmen that the revolutionary democratic wave of the radical Reconstruction beat in vain and finally broke. The advent of imperialism, the epoch of trusts and monopolies at the turn of the century, froze the blacks in their post-Reconstruction position, land the semi-slaves in the South. It blocked the road to the fusion of blacks and whites into one nation on the basis of equality and put the final seal on the special oppression of blacks. The path towards equality and freedom via assimilation was foreclosed by these events, and the struggle for black equality thenceforth was ultimately bound to take a national revolutionary direction. Under the conditions of imperialist and racist opposition, blacks in the South were to acquire all the attributes of a subject nation. They were people set apart by common ethnic origin, economically interrelated in various classes, united by a common historical experience, reflected in a special culture and physiological makeup. The territory of this subject nation was the Black Belt, an area encompassing the Deep South, which, despite massive outmigrations, still contained, and to this day, the country's largest concentration of blacks. Thus, imperialist oppression created the conditions for the eventual rise of a national liberation movement, with its base in the South. The content of this movement would be the completion of the agrarian democratic revolution in the South. That is, the right of self-determination as a guarantee of complete equality throughout the country. The new analysis defined the status of blacks in the North as an unassimilatable national minority who could not escape the oppression of the fleeing South. The shadow of the plantation falls upon them throughout the country, as the semi-slave relation of the Black Belt continually reproduces black inequality and servitude in all walks of life. There are certain singular features of the submerged Afro-American nation which differentiate it among other oppressed nations, and which have made the road toward national consciousness and identity difficult and arduous. Afro-Americans are not only a nation without a nation, but a captive nation, suffering a colonial-type oppression while trapped within the geographic bounds of one of the world's most powerful imperialist countries. Blacks were forced into the stream of U.S. history in a peculiar manner as chattel slaves, and are victims of an excruciatingly destructive system of oppression and persecution, due not only to the economic and social survivals of slavery, but also to its ideological heritage, racism. The Afro-American nation is also unique in that it is new. It is a new nation, evolved from a people forcibly transplanted from their original African homeland. The people comprised of various tribal and linguistic groups. They are a product, not of their native African soil, but of the conditions of their transplantation. The overwhelming stifling factor of race, the doctrine of inherent black inferiority, perpetuated by ruling class ideology, has sunk deep into the thinking of Americans. It has become endemic, permeating the entire structure of U.S. life. Given this, blacks could only remain permanently unabsorbed in the new world's melting pot. The race factor has also left its stigma on the consciousness of the black nation, creating a powerful mystification about black Americans, which has served to obscure their objective status as an oppressed nation. It has twisted the direction of the Afro-American liberation movement and scarred it while still in its embryonic state. Although the objective base for equality and freedom via direct integration was foreclosed by the defeat of the Reconstruction and the advent of the U.S. As an imperialist power, bourgeois assimilationist illusions were continued into the new era. They were nurtured and kept alive by the nascent black middle class and the liberal detachment of the white bourgeoisie. Conditions, however, were maturing for the rise of a mass nationalist movement. This movement was to burst with explosive force upon the political scene in the period following World War I, with the rise of the Garvey movement. The potentially revolutionary movement of the Black Toilers was diverted into utopian reactionary channels as a peaceful return to Africa. The period of bourgeois democratic revolutions in the United States ended with the defeat of the Democratic Reconstruction. The issue of the black freedom was carried over into the epoch of imperialism, its full solution postponed to the next stage of human progress, socialism. The question has remained and has become the most vulnerable area on the domestic front of U.S. capitalism, its Achilles heel, a major focus of the contradictions in the U.S. society. Blacks, therefore, in the struggle for national liberation, and the entire working class in its struggle for socialism, are natural allies. The forging of this alliance is enhanced by the presence of the growing black industrial working class, with direct and historical connections with white labor. The new line established that the black freedom struggle is a revolutionary movement in its own right, directed against the very foundations of U.S. imperialism, with its own dynamic pace and momentum, resulting from the unfinished democratic and land revolutions in the South. It places the black liberation movement and the class struggle of the U.S. workers in their proper relationship as two aspects of the fight against their common enemy, U.S. capitalism. It elevates the black movement to a position of equality in the battle. The new theory destroys forever the white racist theory of traditionally among class-conscious white workers, which had relegated the struggle of blacks to a subsidiary position in the national movement. Race is defined as a device of national oppression, a smokescreen thrown up by the class enemies to hide the underlying economic and social conditions involved in black oppression, and to maintain the division of the working class. The new theory was to sensitize the party to the revolutionary significance of the black liberation struggle. During the crisis of the 30s, a significant segment of the radicalized white workers would come to see the blacks as revolutionary allies. The struggle for this position had now begun. There remained its adoption by the Comintern and its final acceptance by the U.S. Party. Our draft resolution, which summed up these points, was turned over to Petrovolsky Bennett, chairman of the Anglo-American Secretariat. He seemed quite pleased with it, expressed his agreement, and suggested some minor changes. He agreed to submit it to the Negro Commission at the forthcoming Sixth Congress. I continued to work with Nazanov on preparations for the Congress. By that time, we had become quite a team. Our next project was the South African question, a question which also fell under the jurisdiction of the Anglo-American Secretariat. We were assigned to work with James Laguma, a South African colored comrade, who had come to Moscow to attend the 10th anniversary celebrations and stayed on to discuss with the ECCI and the Anglo-American Secretariat the problems of the South African Party. Specifically, we were to draft a new resolution on the question, restating and elaborating the Comintern line of an independent native South African republic. The word native was in common usage at the time of the Sixth Congress, though today it is considered derogatory and has been replaced with Black Republic or Azania. My stay in the Caucasus. In the middle of April 1928, I left Moscow for a stay in the Caucasus. The winter had been one of those long, cold, dark Moscow winters. Snow was still on the ground in April. Over the whole season, I had been plagued by recurrent seizures of grip. Between the demands of school and preparation for the Sixth Congress, it had been a winter of intense activity. Undoubtedly, this had contributed to my inability to shake off the illness. By the spring, I was pretty run down. The school doctor detected slight anemia and recommended a month of rest in a rest home, so I was shipped off to Kislovodsk, a famous health resort in the northern Caucasus. I traveled south and east across the Ukrainian steppe, where spring had already come to Rostov-on-Don, the administrative center for the northern Caucasus region. Then, on the Minerali Vody, mineral water, the gateway to the Caucasus, a major railroad junction, I changed there for Kislovodsk, a short distance further down towards the mountains. Stepping off the train in Kislovodsk in the early morning, I felt better at my first breath of the fresh mountain air. The city was located in the foothills on the northern range of the Caucasus. Its mineral springs were famed for the medicinal properties, especially for coronary patients. Formerly the famous watering place for the wealthy, it was now enjoyed by all Soviet people. Kislovodsk was the source of the famous Narzan water, which cost 40 or 50 kopecks a bottle in Moscow. Here it bubbled from the ground in numerous springs, and you can drink all you wanted. Checking in at the sanitarium, I was assigned to a room shared by 3 others, 2 workers and a party functionary formed Tbilisi, named Kolya Terseteli. Kolya was a tall, handsome, swarthy young man. He cut quite a figure in his long Georgian robotchaka, complete with kinjal, a dagger. He immediately took me in charge and became my constant companion during my stay there. After I had been examined by a doctor who prescribed daily baths, Kolya took me around on a sightseeing tour. The sun was coming up over the parks, cypress trees, and places for open-air concerts. After several weeks, I felt much better and was soon chafing at the bit, bored with the regimen, and eager to return to Moscow. At this point, Kolya suggested that we might try to arrange my accompanying him to his home in Tbilisi, Hot Springs, and stay for a week before returning to Moscow. I was delighted and had no difficulty in getting both my release from the sanitarium and permission from my school to make the trip. Tbilisi, the Florence of the Caucasus, was a beautiful modern city stretching for miles alongside the Kura River. It had spacious avenues lined by stately cypress trees, handsome, beautiful buildings and apartments, and magnificent cathedral, its great central dome flanked by 4 cupolas, framed against a background of the mighty Caucasus chain, with Mount David rising 2,500 feet above the city. It was a mixed population of mainly Georgians, Armenians, Jews, and some Turk or Tartars. Kolya explained there had actually were more Armenians than Georgians living in the capital of Georgia. He went on to tell me that in the Caucasus, ethnic groups often overlap their natural boundaries, as finely constituted. This was particularly so in the case of Armenians, who were the victims of the genocidal persecutions and dispersal by Turkey. As a result, there are more Armenians in Azerbaijan and Georgia than in the Armenian Republic itself. In the old days, German nationalism was directed more against the Armenians than against the Russians. The Armenians had a large merchant class. They dominated commerce and were an obstacle to the growth of the weak Georgian bourgeoisie, who retaliated by whipping up national animosity against the Armenians. Hence, national hatred was often directed against rival national groups rather than the dominant Tsarist power. And the Tsarist government exploited these animosities fully. The area was known for bloody battles between the various ethnic groups, but all that ended with the revolution, Kolya said, and with the establishment of the Trans-Caucasus Federation, based on national equality and voluntary consent. With the federation was composed three republics: Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. The Georgian Republic had three minority districts: Abkhazia, Azaria as autonomous republics, and Yugo-Ossetia as an autonomous region. The national language and cultures were flourishing under the new regime. As you see here in Tbilisi, we have Georgian, Armenian, and Russian theaters, Kolya told me. Kolya hailed in Izvozik, and we rode to his apartment, located on one of the broad tree-lined avenues of the city. Arriving there, we were happily greeted by his family. His wife, an attractive young schoolteacher, received me warmly and told me that Kolya had written her about me. They had two beautiful children, a boy of about 3 and a girl about 5. They seemed fascinated with my appearance and couldn't take their eyes off me. I was undoubtedly the first black man they had ever seen. On being told by Kolya to shake hands with the black uncle, the boy hesitatingly extended his little hand. I took it and shook it gently. When he withdrew it, he looked to see if there was some black come off, and seemed rather surprised it hadn't. "No, it won't come off," I said, and we all laughed. I had experienced this reaction from Russian children in Moscow, and it never failed to amuse me. The Suratellis lived in a clean, neatly furnished 3-bedroom apartment on the second floor of the building, with a balcony over the sidewalk. As if reading my thoughts, Kolya said, "Don't worry. We all usually sleep in one room. The other is for my brother, who stays here with us. He's out of town, so you can stay in his room." Kolya was anxious to check in at the party office where he worked, so we left our baggage and walked to his office a short distance away. I was interested in the people we passed. They looked better dressed than the Russians back in Moscow. The costumes were gayer. Perhaps it was due to their milder climate. Kolya served as the deputy secretary of the Agitprop department of the Tbilisi Committee of the Communist Party. He introduced me to his fellow workers in the department. They all seemed glad to see me and remarked how well he looked after his rest. They were speaking Georgian. Kolya asked them to speak in Russian in deference to me. They all seemed multilingual. Kolya, I knew, besides his native Georgian, spoke Russian, Armenian, and some French. The comrades insisted on calling a conference. Like most party officials, they were well informed on both domestic and international questions and were an educated audience. They asked me my impressions of their country, and also had questions about the situation in the United States, about the conditions of blacks. Kolya told them that I was a student at the Lenin School in Moscow, and formerly I had been at Kutva. They knew about Kutva, as they too had sent students there. They were interested in the work I had done in preparation for the upcoming 6th Congress, and they were familiar with Stalin's report to the 15th Party Congress from that December, where he described the international situation. They asked me questions about the international situation and the war danger, and we exchanged opinions. Kolya explained that I was only going to be in town for a couple of days. It was Friday then, and I was scheduled to leave on Sunday. As I remember, we took a car from the pool, and 2 or 3 people from the office accompanied us on sightseeing tours along the banks of the river. We returned to Kolya's home, where his wife had a delicious big meal waiting for us: shishlik, fruits, and pastries. We sat up until late that night telling stories. The next day, we saw a number of places of interest, bathed in the famous hot sulfur springs. We went up the summit of Mount David and saw the old church on the mountain, which dated back to centuries, and the mausoleums of famous Georgian poets and patriots. All in all, we spent a very enjoyable weekend together. On Sunday, Kolya and his wife took me to the station and put me on a train for Moscow. 3 days later, I was back home. I saw Kolya once again when he was on a visit to Moscow, and I took him out to dinner. End of Chapter 9 of Black Bolshevik. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Book Club Commune. Next episode, we're going to be reading Chapter 9, the 6th Congress of the Comintern, A Blow Against the Right. And shit is about to get real. Again, thank you all for listening. Please share this podcast with your friends and comrades, anyone who you think needs to read this book or any future books that I do. I really appreciate just spreading the word about this. That's all I have for you this week. Solidarity, and keep on reading.